Let's walk through what this actually looks like in a chaotic combat encounter.
Sure, let's test it.
The sources detail a highly specific, notoriously optimized character build known as the Goliath Battlemaster, often called the Avalanche Engine. Walk me through the pure crunch-focused version of this build first.
Okay, so the Combat Cruncher looks at this Goliath and just sees an engine of raw spatial efficiency. We are talking about a character with a strength score of 20, which gives a massive +5 modifier to hit and to damage. But the engine really turns on with the integration of two specific feats, Polearm Master and Sentinel.
Right, because together, those two feats create a brutal action, bonus action, and reaction loop.
A total lockdown.
Let's put this Goliath in a narrow mountain pass.
Yeah.
In a purely mechanical game, the player just looks at the grid. They have a pole arm with a 10-foot reach. An enemy walks into that 10-foot radius. The player says, I use my reaction from Polearm Master to attack. I roll an 18 to hit. I deal 12 damage. Because of the Sentinel feat, their speed drops to 0. My turn is over.
Yeah.
It is incredibly efficient. It locks down the battlefield, but it sounds completely soulless. It's
Right.
literally just geometry and subtraction.
It is entirely soulless. But let's contrast that with the synthesized version of that exact same mechanical sequence. That 20 strength is no longer just math. It is the physical, heavily scarred result of this Goliath holding the line alone against impossible odds in their past.
So it's the physical weight of their history manifesting on the battlefield.
Exactly. So when that enemy enters the 10-foot radius in the mountain pass, the player doesn't just say, I rolled a hit. They narrate the sheer force of the Sentinel reaction. The Goliath slams the butt of their halberd into the stone, cracking the earth beneath them, and the player declares, the earth itself decrees your position static. You shall not pass the fault line.
Oh, that's so much better. The mechanics completely dictate the outcome. The enemy takes 12 damage and their speed becomes 0, but the synthesis dictates the reality of the scene. You feel the weight of the Goliath's history. You feel the tactical superiority.
Yes,
But I do have to play devil's advocate here.
go for it.
Isn't this just putting lipstick on a pig? I mean, you're still just rolling math. You're just using much fancier words to describe a standard attack of opportunity. Does overlaying narrative onto a rigid mathematical blueprint actually improve the game? Or does it just make the math cruncher feel less guilty about playing an overpowered build?
That is a completely fair criticism, and
Yeah.
to answer it honestly, we have to pivot to a brutal critique of where the synthesis approach actually falls short. Because you are right, the game world does not care about your poetry.
Exactly. The dice do not care how cool your backstory is.
The primary gap in this approach, particularly with hyper-specialized melee builds like that Avalanche engine we just talked about, is that it assumes enemies will politely walk right into your perfectly optimized 10-foot melee zone.
Which they won't always do.
No, it assumes a perfectly flat, two-dimensional battlefield where everyone wants to fistfight you on your terms. It is a spatial failure.
So what happens when you introduce verticality? Say this Goliath is facing a manticore. The manticore is flying 40 feet in the air, just raining down tail spikes. Or, as one of our sources points out, what if this Goliath is caught in a chaotic, three-dimensional environment, like a plummeting, burning battle balloon?
Well, in those scenarios, your entire action economy engine, your beautifully synthesized Polearm Master and Sentinel combo, is rendered completely useless.
You can't reach them.
You are an anchor in the sky. The hyper-specialization becomes a massive liability. When you optimize exclusively for controlling a 10-foot radius, anything sitting at 11 feet is an existential threat to your survival. And suddenly, your narrative of being this immovable fault line feels ridiculous because you're just standing there getting shot.
And beyond the spatial failures, there's the inevitability of the random number generator, the dice. The synthesis approach, as beautiful as it sounds when everything works, often completely overlooks the statistical certainty of engine failure.
Over a long campaign spanning hundreds of hours, you will roll natural ones. You will encounter enemy spellcasters that bypass your physical armor entirely and target your mental saving throws. You will get stunned, you will be paralyzed, or put to sleep.
And this is where the narrative overlay fractures. If your build's entire identity relies on mechanical perfection, on being this immovable avalanche engine, a single failed wisdom saving throw breaks the math and the storytelling simultaneously, you aren't the immovable object anymore. You're just a paralyzed character drooling on yourself while the party takes hits.
Right. And because the synthesis approach falls short when the dice betray the player, our sources suggest we must introduce new methods and techniques to patch these exact gaps. You cannot just hope to win initiative and roll perfectly every single time.
Which brings us to what the sources call the system restart protocol. How do we patch this Goliath build so the story and the math can actually survive the chaos of the game?
First, you integrate specific mechanical patches into the build itself to cover those vulnerabilities. To counter those temporal failures, the stuns, and the paralysis, you might take a feat like Resilient, specifically for Wisdom.
Okay, how does that help?
This provides a physical, mathematical way to escape mental lockdowns. Your character's sheer force of will translates to a higher saving throw, ensuring you don't lose your agency.
And to patch the spatial failures like the flying manticore problem, the sources suggest creating an anti-air javelin trip attack protocol. Now, if I'm listening to this right now, I'm probably thinking, wait a minute, developing an anti-air javelin protocol sounds exactly like the heavy, tedious homework you promised we wouldn't be doing. How is this different?
Because it isn't about memorizing complex new rules, it is about creatively applying the ones you already have. If you can't reach the manticore with your polearm, you pull out a javelin and use one of your battle master maneuvers, specifically the trip attack.
Oh, I see.
You mathematically force the flying threat to make a strength save. If they fail, they plummet to the ground. You bring them down into your 10-foot radius so the story can continue on your terms. You are just translating your existing toolkit to solve a three-dimensional problem.
That completely flips the dynamic. But perhaps the most vital new technique the sources suggest is reframing the concept of degrees of failure. When you miss an attack or fail a skill check, it shouldn't represent character incompetence.
Consider our legendary Goliath. If they swing their halberd and roll a 2, they didn't just clumsily drop their weapon. They are a master of combat. They don't make amateur mistakes. If you experience a severe failure, missing a target's armor class by 5 or more, the synthesis approach reframes that as a natural plot twist or an environmental hazard.
So the enemy's armor was forged from an unnatural alien alloy that somehow absorbed the kinetic force of your strike. Or the plummeting battle balloon violently lurched to the side right as you swung, throwing off your perfect aim.
Exactly.
This keeps the character's competence completely intact while acknowledging the mechanical failure. It ensures that the story never stops, even when the math fails you.
To bring this deep dive to a close, we really have to connect this mechanical patching back to the player's actual psychology at the table. Because how you perceive failure dictates your entire experience of the game. Let's compare the effects of pure metagame crunch versus synthesis on the player's mind, specifically looking at what happens during an engine failure.
In pure crunch, missing turns or getting stunned leads to sheer unfiltered frustration. It is what the tabletop community calls turn deletion.
It's the worst feeling.
It is. Imagine waiting 15 minutes at a table of 5 players for your turn to finally come around. You make a wisdom saving throw. You fail. The game master says you are paralyzed. Next player. You just lost your turn. Your engine flooded, and you do nothing. It breeds deep resentment toward the game and the game master.
But when you shift to the synthesis approach, you utilize what the sources call the tectonic override. By combining specific mechanics like the Fighter's Indomitable feature, which is a hard-coded reboot that lets you re-roll a failed save, and Second Win, which provides a burst of recovery momentum, the player executes a system restart protocol.
And the psychological impact of that is profound. It shifts the player from feeling completely helpless and frustrated by a bad roll to actually anticipating a cinematic power spike.
You lean into the failure.
Exactly. You don't ignore the bad roll. You absorb that poor dice roll directly into your character's legend. You were momentarily paralyzed by the spell, your muscles locked up, the enemy closed in for the kill, laughing. And then, using Indomitable, you forcefully override the failure, recover your stamina, shatter the magical hold, and strike back harder.
It turns a moment of extreme vulnerability, a moment that normally causes players to tune out and check their phones, into the absolute most exciting part of the combat. The mechanics become the dramatic tension. You aren't choosing between being effective and being interesting. You are using your mechanical effectiveness and even your mechanical failures as the very vehicle that drives the narrative forward.
Which leads us with a broader application of this concept. I want you to think about how this applies far beyond the tabletop. What if you applied narrative synthesis to your real-life failures? If you bomb a major presentation at work, or you miss a crucial creative deadline, what if you didn't internalize that as personal incompetence? What if instead you treated it as a natural plot twist in your own campaign? It's an environmental hazard that sets up your own system restart protocol. The math of your life might fail occasionally, the dice might roll natural ones, but the story is always pushing forward. You are flawed to perfection.